Okay, so coming back to this, I just wanted to put this up there to show some measure of development that was important, not just to the South, but to America as the whole. There you see a map of the United States railroads built by 1870, and then 20 years later by 1890. And clearly, this exponential growth. And the South was as active as any region in investing in the railroad, which became the artery, the conduit for both people and resources, contributing to an image of America as a more and more unified place, unified along the lines of a giant network, or a web, because that's what a rail network basically creates. So bringing more in the way of consolidation to the country, but also the intensive investment in something like a railroad network is a perfect way to create these different pockets between prosperity and poverty. Because if you look at the South, well, where once you had this kind of spread out sprawl of agrarian society, now increasingly you had places that were either on the railroad or were not on the railroad. Those that are, well, that's where people go. That's where you have the cities and the towns growing up, and those that are not are often the places that simply empty out. So it does also contribute to this kind of pockmarked kind of structure to America at this time. So this feeds into this idea of manifest destiny, which basically refers to the consolidation of America, the increasing unification of it, especially the settlement of the West. But you can just see by the end of the 19th century, you do have more in this way of overall unity. Going to talk about the idea of manifest destiny and the frontier. Emerson and Dewey, that's Ralph Waldo Emerson and John Dewey, those are American philosophers who speak about this idea. And the cowboy, that's a figure, a kind of archetype within American culture who's worth discussing. You see, just to kind of reiterate that idea of the expansion of America from its original small sliver along the eastern coast. You see there the original 13 colonies. Of course, what stands out now is not occupying really a vast tract of land as far as the United States is concerned as a whole. And then steadily westward from Great Britain in the years following the Revolution, the Louisiana Purchase, which I mentioned before, and then land that once belonged to Mexico, so further and further westward, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. You see a very famous painting, a kind of idealized but at the same time, a skeptical depiction of American, quote, American progress. The often cited ideal of manifest destiny speaks to the steady westward expansion of America during the 19th century. And it's an idea that has been thrown around in the culture and is still deployed today in a variety of different contexts. The main basis for the notion of manifest destiny is one of inevitability. The notion that it is inevitable that American pioneers and settlers are basically going to take over more and more land, that they are endowed with certain abilities when it comes to industriousness as well as intelligence, and also that they bring with them the backing of a kind of capitalist system or a capitalist mentality. And this is precisely what's going to fuel this westward movement, encompassing more and more territory. And it's been caught up with all sorts of bizarre mythological and religious narratives as well. This kind of idea of a people endowed with a particular spiritual destiny. So not even something that they choose, but they're just in a way predestined to take over the Western land. And keep in mind, of course, that this meant displacing assimilating in some cases, or even killing the people who already lived in these territories. So you had Native Americans, a wide variety of different Native American groups that lived there, and also that these areas, these territories, originally belonged to other countries. Well, the idea of manifest destiny is saying that there is something uniquely inherent in the American people that bequeaths them the right to take over this land for themselves and to develop it on their own terms. In truth, though, expansion had many competing aspects to it. And a lot of the time, I think the mistake that people make, well, aside from basically just blindly affirming and celebrating that idea, I mean, that's one mistake. But the other mistake is to think of this as a kind of organized policy that the U.S. government always had. That from the start, it was basically hell-bent on this project of expansion and settlement and conquest. Well, not really. I mean, from the start, the U.S. government, or even back when it was a colony of the British Empire, from the start, the government there was always a little bit skeptical or uncertain about this idea of westward expansion. And largely for one of the reasons I mentioned previously, this expansion often entailed losing control of people, having them move further and further away from the centers of power in the East, basically just having them go make their own way out on the frontier. The other thing to keep in mind is that this kind of westward expansion involved a whole slew of different competing forces and groups, and I mentioned some of them. For instance, the California Gold Rush. There you had another instance of, quote, manifest destiny, except the people going to California, they were doing so because they were seeking gold, first and foremost. So it wasn't really obeying the dictates of this higher ideal. They were just looking to make themselves wealthy, and that's why they ended up in California. So too with particular groups of people like the Mormons, for instance, the Mormons who took their trek out and ended up in Utah. There you have an individual religious group, which again adheres to an idea of manifest destiny, but they do it on their own terms. They have their own specific reasons for doing this. So manifest destiny, it becomes this kind of umbrella term which encompasses a whole different series of migrations and events, and basically kind of retroactively explains why America ended up conquering the West and becoming this unified country. And as often happens with retroactive explanations, it's full of this kind of mythology. I mean, that's usually what happens. It's after the fact that people start idealizing or mythologizing events. During the events, people don't think they're living myths, right? They're just doing things for whatever practical reason. The mythology started towards the end of the 19th century. Frederick Jackson Turner is probably the person who is most famously associated with this idea, where he comes up with a distinctly frontier interpretation of American democracy, which would play a big role, I would say, in shaping the culture. Jackson's basic idea, or Turner's basic idea, I should say, is that American democracy exists not per se in institutions. It doesn't really exist in the White House or the Capitol or in Washington, D.C., or in the Constitution or in the voting system or any of those things. Those are the kinds of infrastructures of democracy. They're supposed to represent the system. But real American democracy is something that's forged far away from the centers of power. You have to go out into the countryside, go out onto the frontier, and that's where you encounter real democracy. Why do you find it there? Well, because that is the realm of rampant individualism. That's where you find people just trying to make it on their own, trying to carve out their own piece of land and territory, tame the wilderness, as the phrase goes, or even to dispel whoever happens to be there already. Those are people who just work independently for themselves, free of the trappings and restrictions of government, free from the trappings and restrictions of a kind of parent society. And so Turner said, with the closing of the frontier, which happened at the end of the 19th century, once the West is completely incorporated into the United States, basically that's it for a real ideal of American democracy. Now it's all kind of been reduced to the level of the institution. Say there, Turner's thesis framed American identity as a hybrid culture combining the institutions of Europe and a rugged wilderness. It's always questionable to what degree that, quote, wilderness really existed. It depends on how you look at it. But that was basically the notion of people who came from Europe originally, or people of European descent. They bring the institutions of Europe with them, or even the mentality of those institutions, such as the original English settlers who work within an English legal and political system. So that's their frame of reference. But once they're in America, they've left behind the old world, and they're trying to bring that mentality into an open wilderness, so the countryside. And it's the melding or the combination of those two factors that produces an American identity. So it's a kind of combination of two different things. See, Ralph Waldo Emerson, American philosopher and a founder of transcendentalism. Emerson might actually be the most famous philosopher in American history, and he speaks about this idea of manifest destiny to an extent, but I think we would just say the frontier or frontier mentality in America and its central importance. You see an essay called Nature that he published in 1836. So this is prior to the Civil War. And here he is speaking about the unique relationship that the individual develops in relation to nature. You see a depiction of his so-called transparent eyeball. It says, quote, "I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. In the wilderness, I find something more dear and connate than in streets or villages. In the tranquil landscape, and especially in the distant line of the horizon, man beholds somewhat as beautiful as his own nature." You know, there, the valorization of the natural world, the wilderness, and again, in opposition to the centers of urbanization or institutional authority. So if you want a real experience of individualism, if you want just a real experience in general, you have to find it in the natural world, in the wilderness. You see another work, this was a speech he delivered in Cambridge in 1837 on the American scholar. Look at a little part of this to understand his overall idea and how he links this to the frontier, the American West. Emerson was very interested in this idea of constructing a distinctly American intellectual and national identity. And he's working again in the early part of the 19th century. So this is the point where America is a young, new country. It still is after the Civil War, I mean, relative to some other places. So there is this notion of, well, we have this country emerging and growing around us. We have these political, legal systems. We have cities growing. Okay, we have all this stuff, all the trappings of civilization. But what is the national identity on a kind of intellectual scale? How do we conceive of American national identity in the tradition of scholarship or in the tradition of philosophy? These get into some of the weighty, deeper questions about what it means to be an individual or to have a relationship with the natural world. Emerson seems to have this kind of notion of excitement attached to that because there's this idea of, well, creating something that could be quite new and original. Since American identity is a young thing at this point, there's also this notion of writing into existence a new form of thought or a new intellectual tradition, a new form of philosophy, something that could be uniquely American, all its own. So maybe influenced by Europe, but nonetheless a kind of original creation. So that's the basic idea that he's going for. Speaks here about the fragmentation and the division of the individual, and here this speaks to the notion of what he sees happening in American society as early as this period, and also why the wilderness, the frontier, provides an alternative idea. Says here, the planter, who is man sent out into the field to gather food, is seldom cheered by any idea of the true dignity of his ministry. He sees his bushel and his cart and nothing beyond, and sinks into the farmer instead of man on the farm. The tradesman scarcely ever gives an ideal worth to his work, but is ridden by the routine of his craft, and the soul is subject to dollars. The priest becomes a form, the attorney a statute book. the mechanic, a machine, the sailor, a rope of the ship. So what he's speaking against here is the kind of fragmentation of the individual through labor, where a person can just be reduced to the machine that they're working on, or reduced to a simple implement or a tool. It's this idea of breaking the individual down into these piecemeal parts. And what he's looking for is a kind of unified vision of the individual, a unified vision of the person. Says here, and this is kind of reinforcing the idea he mentioned last time, the first in time and the first importance of the influences upon the mind is that of nature, and thus the scholar is or should be a person of action just as much as any laborer or farmer. So in this idea of American scholars, people who work in places like Cambridge, Massachusetts, home of Harvard University, going out onto the frontier, becoming pioneers out into the wilderness, because the first encounter with the natural world is as important as reading through books or working at a university or doing any of those things. What Emerson also kind of seeks out is this idea of a first encounter with the wilderness to really galvanize that idea of newness. The newness and the novelty of American identity should work in tandem with a kind of a first encounter with a new landscape, a place that nobody has ever seen before. And that was part of his idea of the pioneering heritage of America, going out into a wilderness that is untapped, unvisited, and encountering something for the very first time. Cornel West is an African-American philosopher and social critic and author of The American Invasion of Philosophy, who is in many respects an exponent of Emerson's ideas, but adds these critiques to it, sort of pushing back a little bit against his ideas. For one thing, West says that Emerson believes in transformation, but his idea of change is grounded on the powers of the individual, not on collective action. So when Emerson speaks about the formation of an American national identity and the importance of the wilderness to forming American democracy, he's really just speaking about the individual, the individual, the individual, the individual, not what we would call collective action, not a kind of a communal spirit, but just this idea of what the individual can accomplish on their own. And wouldn't that become such a big part of this whole American dream ideal, and indeed American democracy at large? If we follow this idea of the frontier as really fostering a vision of American democracy, it's just really about the individual doing everything they can, and to a degree doing it in isolation, right? Just free from everything else and everybody else, just me doing my own thing with my own personal rights. And West points out, well, that's not really a kind of a forum for collective action or pushing for legislation or pragmatic change or fighting for egalitarianism or equality on a mass scale. It's just the individual escaping anything that might inhibit their own personal freedom. And West also says, and I think that this is a very relevant point as well, this vision of the transparent eyeball, an attempt to wipe out past history and imagine ourselves as always standing at the beginning of a new era. It's fine for Emerson, and indeed Americans in general, to speak about how this first encounter with a wilderness is going to foster this independent spirit and a true experience of democracy, but it never is a first encounter with the wilderness. There were people there already. The only way you can convince yourself that you're entering a space that nobody has ever seen before, that nobody has ever been in before, is by rewriting history. You kind of have to sort of wipe away the past and imagine, well, none of that stuff actually happened previously. I'm here for the first time, and this is the first time anyone has ever been here before. So you see, I think, a couple of the kind of competing strands of American history and culture which intersected this idea of democracy in that country. Yeah, the idea of individualism, rampant independence, also this idea constantly of making something new, always sort of seeing it as being the first time, the most original experiment in republicanism, the most original experiment in democracy. But the only way that America as a whole can convince itself of that is if it basically wipes out the past as much as possible, basically pretends that a bunch of stuff didn't happen and puts itself at the start of a kind of new epoch, a new era. So different kind of competing strands in this idea of manifest destiny. And finally, John Dewey, American philosopher, leading contributor to pragmatism. That was an American philosophical movement. And I'd say you have transcendentalism as well, but pragmatism kind of became this idea of an American national philosophy, so something that's quintessentially American, which exists in the intellectual tradition. And Dewey was certainly someone who was very big on this idealization of the American frontier as part of the U.S. heritage, but not in a kind of naive way, because he was someone who was certainly a proponent of civil rights, of feminism, of equal rights in the early 20th century. But he puts his idea, his vision, in opposition to what had happened to American society. It says here from his book, The Public and the Problems, from the standpoint of the individual, creative democracy, that's what he's talking about, consists in having a responsible share according to capacity in the groups to which one belongs and in participating according to need in the values which the groups sustain. From the standpoints of the groups, it demands liberation of the potentialities of members of a group in harmony with the interests and goods which are common. Since every individual is a member of many groups, this specification cannot be fulfilled except when different groups interact flexibly and fully in connection with other groups. Regarded as an idea, democracy is not an alternative to other principles of associated life. It is the idea of community life itself. So a couple of important points there, which also fit into this frontier thesis approach. Democracy is, again, not an institutional practice, first and foremost. It's an experience, first and foremost. And I think he's probably onto something there. It's one thing to speak about the democratic institutions that exist in a given country, or to point to laws or voting legislation, or even to name your country the Democratic People's Republic of whatever, etc., right? To kind of try to weave democracy into the name. But the people have to experience it. You have to believe that that is part of your day-to-day experience. So the notion of being a free individual, of having individual rights, that is something that is embedded in personal experience on a day-to-day basis. So if an individual doesn't believe it, they don't believe they're living in a real democracy, well then the state is not actually fulfilling its ideals. The other side to that too, this vision of people belonging to different communities simultaneously and moving among them. That's kind of a vision of the American West, which might not have ever existed, right? But nonetheless is one that he draws upon. The notion of a kind of flexibility and fluidity in identity. That nobody should just be streamlined and hemmed in to one specific role. Just because you work as a doctor, a teacher, a peasant, or a machinist, it doesn't mean that that should be the only thing you ever do, where you're just basically locked into the single environment, living on the equivalent level of a machine. No, there should be a lot of different competing forces operating in someone's life, and they should have the ability to occupy a lot of different roles simultaneously. Yes, labor, artist, intellectual, political thinker, all of those things, and you can move between the different groups. Dewey in particular was speaking against what he saw as the kind of growth of the Great Society in America, a kind of opposite idea of a very machine-like consolidated American nation state. Finally, the figure of the cowboy. Well, if you were to come up with somebody who ended up being this emblematic figure of the American frontier, it wouldn't really be the figure of the pioneer or the scholar, as Emerson has it, the scholar who leaves the academic environment and goes and works as a laborer. No, it would probably have to be the figure of the cowboy, this kind of iconic archetype of American culture. There you see John Wayne, one figure who kind of embodied that ideal in Hollywood, and the Marlboro Man, from a cigarette advertisement, another kind of figure. The cowboy becomes exactly that notion of this sort of independent person. And how often we see this figure of the cowboy in American culture who does represent the law to an extent. Right? He's someone who maybe works for the law, the sheriff's office, but at the same time, he's always this kind of rogue cop. He's someone who's sort of outside of the law at the same time, someone who basically does his own thing and is much more at home in this kind of environment, this scraggly, kind of barren place, not in cities, not in towns, but no, out on the frontier, away from the trappings of a civilization. Mentioned their intersectional identity, a term that is worth dwelling on for a moment. Say, intersectional identity typically refers to the different ways that categories come together to form someone's social identity. And here I'm talking about different categories such as race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexuality, class, and others as well. All these different categories. And we think of someone who, from a social perspective, could occupy a series of different categories. Someone could say, well, their ethnicity is this, their gender is this, their sexuality is this, class position is this. Intersectionality makes the basic claim, the basic argument that all of those categories are intertwined. That it's a mistake to treat them in isolation as being separate from one another, that they come together to form this kind of network of different identity positions, and so someone occupies all of them simultaneously. So we shouldn't just speak about race and ethnicity in isolation or gender in isolation, but all of these different categories come together at these cross sections. I mention this because it's interesting to think about the cowboy becoming a kind of iconic figure of who exactly adheres to this ideal of American democracy cultivated out on the frontier. Well, it's not everybody. I mean, it's not everybody in American society, because there you can go down the categories. Race, ethnicity, you'd expect the typical cowboy to be white, American of European descent. Gender, male, definitely, although there can be exceptions, just as there can be exceptions to the first one. Sexuality, straight, absolutely, right? Hyper-masculine figure, although there can be exceptions to that as well, right? As has been depicted in films. Class is the kind of one that's a little bit more free-floating. I mean, what class exactly does the cowboy belong to? These ones are, at least in the mainstream portrayal, pretty set and fixed. But in terms of his class position, he's working class, I suppose you could say. But usually you would think of this iconic figure of the cowboy as having a kind of classlessness. You know, someone who doesn't really slot evenly into one particular position in the American social hierarchy, but is more of this kind of rogue, free-floating figure who can occupy any of those positions, giving him that kind of everyman gloss. And the last topic to talk about today, the Gilded Age, which defines the latter part of the 19th century. There are three topics to go through here: building the American machine, immigration, subject we mentioned before, and corporations. You see a depiction of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, John Wilkes Booth, killing him in 1865. And I put that up there because that seemed to be that iconic moment representing a real transition in American history, marking the end of the Civil War, but also the death of Lincoln, this iconic figure, great martyr, great emancipator, as the various idealistic narratives cast him to be. And afterwards, there was a transition in American society where you could say this ideal of unity was fulfilled, but probably not in the way that optimistic people would have wanted, because those who rose to the forefront of the nation were not freed slaves. as the ideals of egalitarianism would have had it, or political leaders like a Lincoln. You didn't really have the same sorts of famous political leaders thereafter, at least not for the rest of the 19th century, or pioneers for that matter. I mean, Emerson and Dewey might have spoken about this idea of the pioneer out on the frontiers becoming the very iconic American figure, but who really was driving the consolidation, the unification of America in the latter part of the 19th century? Well, robber barons more than anyone else. Robber barons basically means corporate leaders, corporate people involved in business, wealthiest class business magnates, but often involved in the shadiest dealings, whether it's connections to criminal activity or shady politics, of which there was a lot at this time. And you note the kind of combination of the words there: a robber, so someone who just steals from other people, and a baron refers to a member of the aristocracy. So the idea of America was there was no aristocracy there. There isn't supposed to be this idea of hereditary privilege there. So this is certainly a slighting term, basically introducing a new version of the aristocracy, these wealthy business owners who stole from other people. And these were the kind of leaders in the development of the American machine. This is exactly what Dewey is speaking about from the early 20th century perspective: consolidation, railroad networks, urbanization, the development of the factory culture. All those things had been percolating over the early part of the 19th century, but then they kind of just took off in the latter part of the 19th century. This is where America kind of comes into its own, so to speak. This is the groundwork for America to emerge as a superpower nation, which it would do in the 20th century. And people speak about, well, when did that actually start happening? When did America become this kind of a dominant player in international politics? Well, in terms of tracing that lineage and seeing when it did start to happen, I mean, you have to go back all the way to the late 19th century with the development of this machine-like society civilization. There you see Machinery Hall, part of the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. Yes, by this point, already 100 years since it actually became an independent nation. So there was this big exposition, big celebration, American national identity. And what was the main focus of the exposition? Well, being a centennial celebration, there were a lot of different things there, but people commented on the focus on machinery, the kind of mechanical apparatuses. So less so this kind of celebration of American freedom or military strength or American artistic accomplishments. No, it's more the kind of industrial stuff that we can build. Look at all the incredible mechanics that we have around. A kind of focus on engineering as opposed to artistry. And so they would show off all these different things: drills, mowers, Pullman cars, sewing machines, etc. All sorts of different machines featured there, kind of celebrating that idea of the Industrial Revolution and the way that it landed in force in America, and the way that this is really the future for the country, if not the world. Between 1865 and 1900, the shape of the country seemed to change from one of communities scattered across a vast land to an image of a single industrial and economic web. The railroad helped a lot there, providing that textile image, textbook image of a consolidated web. And this idea of communities scattered across a vast land, that might have been Dewey's vision of America at a particular point, with all these different communities close to one another and you move between them. But it was almost as though this giant steel or metal web had just sort of descended onto the tract of land, bringing everything together. It was a period of enormous infrastructural development, urban development as well, access to enormous resources: coal, iron ore, petroleum, gold, silver, and copper. The American land was giving up all of those things to those who wanted to mine it, to those who wanted to exploit the land. None of the European countries could lay claim to having this kind of access to resources, not even close. I mean, that's part of the reason why Britain developed this giant empire, because it's a small island nation lacking those kinds of resources. Well, in America, they didn't need to develop their empire because they were just getting all of that stuff from home, and they were controlling huge amounts of the international trade in these items. I mean, they're exchanging coal, I think, rose to something like 3/4 of world trade at this point. And notice again, too, the equivalent of cash crops when we speak about industrial resources, the kinds of things that you can sell to anybody because everybody wants them. Coal and petroleum, they're fuels. Everyone wants them. And so too with precious metals, always valuable to people. You can always find a buyer for this stuff. In 1860, before the war, America was a second-rate industrial nation. No one was really speaking about them in those kinds of terms. The Industrial Revolution had been present in America for a while. But when you get to 1900, so you're talking there, the space of a generation, it had eclipsed Britain, France, and Germany in terms of its production of manufactured goods, had vastly eclipsed them. I think that they were producing basically as much as those three countries combined. So we speak about the old world and the European empires, but by the latter part of the 19th century, America was already this industrial economic juggernaut, a country that was becoming, well, was the wealthiest country in the world at this time. And not the kind of thing that people were necessarily paying close attention to in Europe because you didn't have the same kind of running statistics all the time that you have today. You have the growth of urbanization and the American city. Again, there were cities prior to the war. They weren't big cities necessarily, but they did exist. But here you see more and more in the way of the growth of the cityscape, the famous skyscrapers that would come to dominate basically the vision of American architecture. But also you had various industrial slums as well. So this was really a kind of a cityscape involving a lot of the haves and the have-nots, those who made a lot of money, those who worked in the factories, and you had enormous discrepancies in terms of wealth and poverty existing at this time. The propagation of wealth was sudden and in many ways chaotic, not really organized. The political leadership that Lincoln had provided, or at least that they say he provided at the time, that kind of was lacking for the rest of the 19th century. Politicians didn't seem to have strong, firm control over the direction of the country. It was almost as though just business and profiteering had rose to the forefront of the nation. One quip said that America had progressed from a state of barbarism to decadence while missing the intervening stage of civilization. Obviously a kind of dodgy quip, but it does kind of capture the outside perception of America that at one time you just had this place that was this agricultural society, and then suddenly it's just into this realm of decadence and profiteering and money flowing everywhere, and there's almost this feeling that it missed some kind of intervening stage, that it just kind of leapt ahead. Yeah, well, actually, we'll do this next time. So, because we're out of time, look at the immigration and the rest about the corporations. So again, no class next week. So enjoy the time off and the reading week, and come back in 2 weeks with the rest of the material.